the newsagents.
Results of the first ballot as follows, and I'll read the results in alphabetical order. Kemi Badenoch, 22 votes. James Cleverley, 21 votes. Robert Jenrick, 28 votes. Priti Patel, 14 votes. Mel Stride, 16 votes. And Tom Tugendhat, 17 votes. So as a result of the ballot, Priti Patel is eliminated from the contest, and there'll be a further ballot next Tuesday to reduce them.
It's like the Oscars, the Olympics, and the Big Brother expulsion all rolled into one, isn't it? The excitement, the
please do not
desk
swear.
banging. Yeah, just keep calm, everyone. You are going to hear the Tory leadership ballot read out in the most undramatic way any of us could actually imagine.
Because that's what you want, of course, from any results. Alphabetical order.
Alphabetical order, no drama.
Yeah, imagine if Eurovision did it like that. That was Bob Blackman, the new chairman of the 1922 committee of backbench Tory MPs, announcing, as Emily said, very undramatic fashion, the first round of the very long Tory leadership contest. And who should emerge on top but Robert Jenrick? Hitherto, not someone that many people might have thought could be in a strong position to lead the Conservative Party and opposition to the end of this decade. And yet here he is, strongly favoured to at least make it into the final round now of the Conservative Party leadership contest. But who is he? What does he stand for? And does he stand a chance of taking the Conservatives back into government? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And the first thing we should say about Robert Jenrick, you know, in the Bob Blackman style of things, is he's the letter J. So comes kind of mid-table through the list as it was read out. He's been there in Parliament since 2014, won a by-election. He has been the Housing Secretary under Johnson. He's been a health minister under Liz Truss. He was Rishi Sunak's immigration minister before he kind of flounced off, left government, said that the Rwanda plan was not stringent enough or not enforceable enough, not going to be strong enough. Suella Braverman, his boss at the time, thought he was a left-winger sent in to spy on her in the Home Office.
Sunak ally.
A Sunak ally, and somebody who, along with Sunak, along with Dowden, originally supported Boris Johnson for the leadership and wrote an op-ed saying, he is our future. And I guess the question we're asking is there a backbone to the Jenrick beliefs? Is he somebody who feels very strongly one way or another? Is he somebody who's just spotted an opening for the leadership? And can he beat somebody like Kemi Badenoch, arguably more charismatic, maybe more abrasive, to that pole position of being the right winger in the race?
Yes, historically speaking, just to remind you of kind of how this works, Conservative Party leadership elections work by the MPs gradually whittling down the candidates to two, and that then goes to the Conservative Party membership, 150,000 of them or so in the country, who generally speaking, ever since this system has been introduced, you can argue about David Cameron, about where he sat on this, but generally speaking have picked the candidate of the right of whoever the sort of wine tasters of the contest, Conservative MPs, put forward. This is an unusually long contest. Sometimes they try and do this very, very quickly. This time, because of the enormity of the defeat and clearly the fact that there is not going to be a general election for a long time, the Conservative Party has decided to let it run long, to kind of imitate that 2005 party contest, where David Cameron emerged. And so they're going to whittle down these numbers from 5 now to 4. They're going to go before the party conference, where they're going to make a series of speeches, and then MPs will whittle down again. And then it will go to the party members. And in early November, we will have a leader. At the moment, Robert Jenrick is in pole position to, at the very least, I think his team feel very confident, to, at the very least, get to the final 2 and go before party members. Well, we're joined now by an avid Tory watcher. I think that's fair to say, isn't it, Ben? Ben Riley-Smith, who's a political editor of the Daily Telegraph and also the author of the book Blue Murder. The renamed book, we've just learned.
That's right, yes. Well, it's called The Right to Rule when it came out last year, but the Tories are no longer ruling. They've been decimated, so it's changed to Blue Murder.
So it's a history of the Conservative Party, basically, from 2010 to 24, which has now been completed.
That's right. All the chaos, 5 different prime ministers. How on earth they kept it going. 120 people interviewed, including 4 of the 5. Theresa May didn't do an interview, actually. But now the
She's
story
normally
is
so
completed.
talkative. That's very
I
odd.
know. I think she had her book coming out at the same time, so that may have been a reason for that. But yes, now there's a new chapter all about the election campaign completing the story.
Well, let's start with where we are now. What did you make of the first ballot yesterday? Any surprises?
Well, I thought it was fascinating. If you are interested in these things, maybe fascinating. I'm not sure that the electorate is viewing this.
You're among
avidly.
friends here. It's fine.
Among friends. I thought it was interesting how far Robert Jenrick was ahead. So he was on 28 votes. Kemi Badenoch was on 22. That's quite a big chunk. That's like 30% more votes than Kemi. It was interesting. There was a lot of chatter in the run-up that Priti Patel was struggling to get the numbers. That proved true. She was the one of the 6 who got knocked out. And it was interesting that Mel Stride did so well. They've released a quote today where they've talked about Melmentum. Because he's on 16 votes, Tom Tugendhat is only just ahead of him on
And they said the Tory
It's the
party would stop
nicknames that
delivering.
kill you in the end, isn't it? I mean, frankly.
But maybe there is Melmentum. I mean, he's made it through to
Well,
the
everyone
second
thought
round.
that he would be the first out, right?
Yeah.
Here he is.
I wonder whether he was a very loyal Rishi Sunak man. He was actually the chief whip for Rishi's campaign.
Why would that give you momentum then? I mean,
Melmentum.
Melmentum. Why would that help you?
I suppose if there's a chunk of people who were around Rishi and loyal supporters of him and wanted something of his relatively moderate centrist position to carry on into, or be certainly part of the debate, then maybe you get behind him.
Let's talk about that then, actually, Ben, because the sort of popular conception is that it will divide into sort of 2 camps: the Jenrick and the Badenoch camp of the sort of right, and the One Nation, one whatever of Mel and James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat. The second camp, first of all.
Yeah.
I mean, why would Mel Stride emerge from that rather than Tugendhat, who has, the kind of military history that the Tories love, or Cleverly, who's kind of done every, major big role in government already?
I'm not sure Mel will definitely emerge from that. The numbers are so tight. I mean, he's on 16, Tugendhat's on 17, Cleverly's just ahead of them. We've got a whole other round of voting to come. If you were a Tory MP, you had to identify one person who is closest and most continuity to Rishi, it would be Mel Stride, rather than James Cleverly, who was a Boris guy who was kept in for party unity, really, at that reshuffle, or Tom Tugendhat, who was lower down the ministerial rung and was never a kind of out-and-out Sunak person. So maybe if you're around Rishi Sunak and you somehow want to defend his project, then Mello's the obvious person to go to. But I think the truth is it's so wide open. So we lose a second candidate next week, then there are these 4 candidates, and as well as the public, I think MPs and members are only beginning to look at them properly. Some of them don't have huge profiles, and the big moment is at conference, where each 4 of them will have a succession of different challenges, really. We're just beginning to get some of the details. The BBC reported today there'll be a question and answer session, there'll be an interview to get to know the candidates, there may be some kind of debate aspect to that at the conference.
The one person who it feels is pretty assured, and they certainly feel that he's assured of getting through to the final 2, is Jenrick. Came top of the poll, did better than expected. You only need a handful of votes, really, because the Conservative Party, Conservative Parliamentary Party, is so small now, and he's already in the high 20s. And I suppose people listening who either might not be familiar with him or are familiar with him might be a bit puzzled as to how this guy, who was actually very much not considered on the right of the Conservative Party until quite recently, could have emerged as a kind of tribune of the right in the last 12 months or so. And a guy who was quite anonymous in some ways could now appear to be on the cusp of at least getting into the final 2. How do you account for that, Ben?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. I think, firstly, you've got to step back and think what this debate is about. This is to be opposition leader in the 2020s and hopefully prime ministers through the 2030s. They've just come out of this big period in government. So I think the mood is looking at the next generation of Tories. And so I think Robert Jenrick's camp believes his relatively low profile is actually a benefit, because possibly voters and members are willing to turn the page on everything that's been and begin to look forward and the renewal. I think the second thing is just what you were saying about his positioning in the party. So there was a big moment in the Boris Johnson leadership race 2019 when he won, that he won support of 3 moderate young fresh Tories, and it was Rishi Sunak, Oliver Dowden and Robert Jenrick. They all came together to write a single op-ed that kind of cemented that Boris wasn't just backed by hardcore older Eurosceptics but also these kind of younger fresher Tories. At that time people thought Robert Jenrick was relatively moderate, as much as they knew that his positions. in the later years of that 14-year run, he definitely moved to the right. So the other big moment he had was he was migration minister under Rishi Sunak, one of the three who had all gone in together to back Boris. And he resigned from Rishi Sunak's cabinet, saying the Rwanda deportation plan is not tough enough, the law proposing it is not tough enough. That was last December. And since then, he's really staked out this position on the right of the party. So in this race, he is the only person explicitly saying, I want to pull us out of the European Convention on Human Rights. And he's one of only two candidates who's saying, I want to bring back David Cameron's 100,000 annual net migration cap. Tom Tugendhat's doing the same.
It's quite hard to do that when you've been the immigration minister and manifestly failed at bringing down the immigration that you now purport to hate, right?
So I think his argument would be, I'm the only one who has credibility on this because I was so frustrated I couldn't do what I wanted to do. I walked out of that government. So that's
But
his
it's
argument.
not just about Rwanda. It's about legal migration. The figures grew exponentially in terms of legal migration under Robert Jenrick, who then left because another scheme, the illegal, or whatever they want to call the asylum-seeking sort of version of migration, wasn't hardcore enough.
Yeah. So their camp's argument on that is he, and I think this is true, he championed some of the measures that Rishi Sunak eventually took, such as massively scaling back the number of dependents people can bring in. And if you look at the numbers since then, since that package was introduced, they are starting to drop quite markedly. So he would say, look, I championed those. I was endlessly meeting with the Prime Minister. I forced him to adopt some of them. They began to have an impact. And ultimately on that and the failure to toughen up Rwanda, I thought, look, I can't stay in this government anymore because you're not going as far as I want.
And that was quite a breach with Sunak, right? Because they had previously been quite close politically and in terms of kind of their positioning and so on.
Massively. I think the big question with Robert Jenrick that will be debated a lot in the coming weeks is, did he move to the right because he genuinely believed had a point of change on all these policies, or was half his eye on the Tory leadership race to come?
He claims to have been almost radicalised from within, doesn't he? He claims, he says that having seen it from within, the inside the Home Office, that he became more and more convinced that radical action was necessary that wasn't emerging or happening at the time.
Yeah, I have had the chance to talk to him about this a number of times. He's described trying to deal with the small boats numbers and talking to people in government, and every possible proposal you came up with, they would say, but the ECHR is going to limit our ability to do something there. So I do think he genuinely believes leaving the ECHR is the right thing to do to secure the reductions in migration and small boat crossings he wants. How that is woven in with his own Tory ambitions, I mean...
He's played it cleverly. I mean,
Yeah,
just looking at the pure politics of it, there's no doubt that if he had resigned in that way, he wouldn't be in the position that he is at the moment.
But I guess, Ben, isn't the question not just what his own policies or his own positioning is, but the parties on either side of the Conservatives now? And you put Jenrick in the middle of Farage and Starmer. And you're not looking at anything that tells you, how he's going to define himself particularly. You put Kemi Badenoch in the middle of Starmer and Farage, and suddenly it seems you've got a much starker identity of what the Conservatives is against or what the Conservatives is for, right? I mean, I'm not just saying three white men all in a row, but I'm saying that you don't really know what the difference would be, particularly between Jenrick and Farage. I think you do feel like you know where Kemi Badenoch would stand against Farage, and she'd probably take the fight to him because she's quite good at fighting.
Yeah, I think if it emerges as those two as the front runners, which the bookies seem to think that's what it's going to become, I think the difference is going to be Jenrick setting out specific policy prescriptions, especially on migration, which are to the right of Kemi. So she is not saying she wants to leave the ECHR. She's not saying she wants to bring migration down into the tens of thousands. And his argument is very much we need to take a step to the right on migration to win back the trust of all these reform voters. The immigration issue is not going to go away. We're in this age of mass migration, and it's going to keep on being an issue for us. Whereas I think Kemi's appeal, and the one being pushed by her camp, is slightly more ethereal, that she has charisma or X factor, or there's something about her that is more engaging, exciting to voters, and the challenge for Jenrick is to prove that he's got the same.
Well, we talk about
What do you think?
Well, I think instinctively it feels like Kemi is more charismatic speaker. Is that what you should be basing everything on? I don't know. Are there other weaknesses in her kind of pitch that won't chime with voters. But I do think there is a kind of star power or an essence that when she speaks, it seems much more engaging and fluid. Robert Jenrick seems to be more a kind of classic politician positioning himself in certain
I mean, generic was
areas.
the nickname, wasn't it? Robert
That was,
Generic.
yeah. I mean, you never know how much these things like the common media thing, because everybody repeats them, or whether that was genuinely true. But yeah, Robert Jenrick was a kind of joke that was slung at him at various points.
I suppose the one person we should talk about briefly is Cleverly.
Yeah.
Because you can see he did better than many people expected. He was within a hair's breadth of coming second. And although his position is a bit nebulous in terms of what he's standing on, he's basically standing on kind of unity, being a kind of good guy, not disliked by anyone in the parliamentary party. But if he can come second, if he can knock Badenoch, who did worse than expected, out in the next round, then actually he's got real momentum to be in the final two.
Certainly possible, and he has the greatest government clout. He's had 2 of the 4 great officers of state, Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary. He speaks pretty fluidly. I know in the election campaign, the Tory HQ loved getting him on the airways because he was very fluid and he spoke in quite an understandable way to voters. I think the challenge again is going to be whether people want to turn the page on the last government or not. So there's a benefit to having all that experience. There's also a downside, which means it's very hard to run away from the policies because you were right there at the top. And the policies he's announced in the campaign are basically the ones that they were running on the election. So a big tax cut. He's done stamp duty, not national insurance. Rwanda, he said he'll bring back that policy. Rishi Sunak was running on it. So he's kind of in line with a lot of the positions they had at the election. So his challenge is saying, look, I'm the guy for the 2030s, even though I'm such a central figure in the early 20-teens.
Do you think the Tory party is, I mean, obviously I'm sure you cover this in the last bit of your book, or the update bit of your book, but do you think the Tory party is quite internalised everything that's happened to them in the last few months? It feels to me as if, I mean, this all has a slightly kind of weird quality, this leadership election so far, because it's so long. They've never been more marginal to British politics. Actually, this election is giving them a slightly kind of phantom feel to actually how it's going to be, because there's still a bit of interest now because of the contest, but the day after, they are going to feel so irrelevant in so many ways.
Yeah, no, to answer the question, no, I don't think they have begun to process the scale and the causes behind it of that defeat. I mean, it was huge. Not since modern British democracy emerged in the 1860s, I think, has there ever been a defeat this bad. They've never got that low on MPs, the Conservative Party. 121, the Lib Dems are 70-something. I mean, it's
Was
weird.
it worse than Corbyn's defeat?
So the
in
Tory,
2019?
Way worse.
you've never had fewer Tory MPs. Yeah. So 121, and the numbers never got that low.
Corbyn had 80 more. He was about 200 in 2019. The Tories are on 120.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the historically, so it was the worst for Labour since I think the 1930s.
Since the 30s, yeah. But this is the worst for any party ever.
Certainly Tory MPs, they'd never had a lower number than 121. And that's why I think there is an argument for this long leadership race, because imagine if you had to knock all the MPs down in July and then they picked someone in September. So
I don't know what I find weird, Ben, is there are no surprises. I mean, I know that sounds odd, but it is a surprise almost that given the scale of defeat, there isn't anyone who's entered the race who were kind of like, oh, dark horse.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Mel.
interesting. I mean,
there's not that many of them. There's only 121.
I guess that's right. There's not going to be new faces for that reason. But, when David Cameron sort of came in 2005, I remember weirdly texting people and going, who is this guy? He felt like there was a sort of a new offering. Whereas none of these faces, I mean, maybe they're new to most of the electorate because, most people don't follow the twists and turns, but it all feels like sort of folded laundry that's been packed on top of each other. Do you know what I mean?
So I guess step one, there aren't that many people around who could run, who have the kind of ministerial experience to do it. Step two, I think that last point you said is a lot of the electorate won't know Kemi Badenoch or Robert Jenrick or Tom Tugendhat, so they will
may
feel
not
quite
even
fresh.
after they're elected, to be frank.
Yeah. The last 3 opposition leaders to lead their party back into power, none of them were there in the election that they lost power.
Interesting.
So Blair was elected 4 years later. Cameron was elected 4 years later. Starmer was elected in 2015, not 2010. So if this is like the last 3 cycles, the person who will lead the Tories back into government is not currently an MP.
Not there. Yeah.
Just since you have published a new version of the book, obviously looking into kind of the last sort of days of the Tory government, anything that surprised you? I mean, was it as chaotic? I mean, when you think about that, it seems, Gamblegate, all these things that already seem sort of ancient history, but Was there anything that surprised you, apart from the timing of the election itself, of course? Because we could be sat here and Sunak could still have been Prime Minister rather than sat
with
on
all
the
those
opposition
lovely
benches.
kind of, drops in sort of inflation rate.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Well, that was, to be
drops in
honest,
immigration.
I think that was the most interesting bit of this extra chapter. So I got to 25 people, including those around Sunak, to understand what happened in the election campaign. When you talk to Tories, clearly they expected to lose, but the thing they're spitting blood about is why did he go in July 2024 when the latest he could have gone was January 2025. You've given up 6 months of Conservative government to do that. So understanding that gamble, and there's a whole load of different reasons. I think one of the big reasons, which we know a bit more about now, is there were huge policy problems coming down the track that were going to emerge. So we know about the prison population. The running out of space was going to become a huge issue. We know about the public sector pay demands that the Tories were reluctant to meet in full, and they feared there'd be new industrial strikes over the summer, which is a terrible backdrop. They also thought, a lot of people around Rishi told me this, which wasn't public at the time, they thought Rwanda was going to get stuck up in the courts, and they didn't think they were going to hit their flights off by July, which, if you cast your mind back 2 months ago, is not what they were saying publicly. Then I think the other area that's really fascinating, and a lot of people talked about this carefully, is Rishi Sunak was feeling fatigue. He was getting hammered week in, week out. This is a guy who has always succeeded all of his life. He was Dishy Rishi, the COVID chancellor, who was so popular when he was handing out the money. And what was happening was he wasn't dragging the Tories up. He was being dragged down in his personal approval ratings. And month after month, they were trying to change the polls. The net zero reset, bringing David Cameron back, trying to go tough on welfare. Nothing was changing it. I think there was an exasperation where he got to the point of saying, look, why don't we just call it? Because maybe that is going to change the situation.
He gave up.
I don't think it is as tough. So some people say, look, he didn't say I want out. But it's this frustration that mixes with all those other factors that just says, well, why don't we just
Let's
go
just
for it?
do
Because
it.
nothing
Roll
is
the dice.
changing and there's dark clouds on the horizon later. Yeah, so I think it was an exhaustion and exasperation rather than a kind of I want out.
There'll be enormous international pressure not to come back. What is their message? End the war. End the war. And so when we want to come back and resume, we'll pay an exorbitant price in many fields, including in the lives of our men.
That was the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking to the Israeli public on television last night. He's been under an enormous level of pressure this week after the general strike that was seen in Israel on Monday to Tuesday, after 6 hostages held by Hamas for all of these months were returned dead, and real vitriol from the hostage families and many, many other Israelis as well, criticising Netanyahu for not prioritising their release and prosecuting the war for his own political interest. And it was a kind of bizarre presentation in some ways, in the sense that Netanyahu stood there on television with a kind of comedy pointer, pointing at a map of Israel and of Gaza, outlining what he said was his plan for Palestine, which involved the permanent occupation of parts of the Gaza Strip, the division of the Strip into 3, a permanent Israeli military presence there, and no sign, despite the fact that it said a plan for Palestine, of the West Bank, implying, some said, that Netanyahu essentially planned to annex it permanently.
Yeah, Netanyahu has always claimed overwhelming support for the war, and that is just not right. The pollsters will tell you that for months surveys are consistently showing a majority of Israelis supporting a deal to free the hostages. Many of the hostage families and wider believe that Netanyahu has prioritised the fight against Hamas, partially for his own personal survival reasons, over and above anything that would allow their sons and daughters, mothers, fathers, to come home alive from Gaza. And right now, we are asking whether there has been a change in the mood. We know that there has been, to some extent, a kind of rally round the flag. You support your government in troubled times, which is where this started back on October the 7th after that Hamas attack. But over the following months, over the subsequent war in Gaza, over the thousands that have perished there, and over this time that has shown how little has been done to bring the hostages back home or end the war, the tide is starting to turn really badly against Netanyahu. Joining us now, Ayala Panievsky, a friend of the podcast who has written extensively on domestic Israeli politics. And I guess what many people can't understand, Ayala, is given the intensity of the mistrust of Netanyahu within his own country, why he's still there, why nothing has actually changed.
Yes, and it has been incredible to see how little connection there was between the immense opposition to Netanyahu and the government on the streets, as you say. And over the past week, it's been every day. There were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. Almost 3% of Israelis were out in the streets protesting. And still, it seems like nothing matters. And the reason is that for Netanyahu, at the moment, the goal is to keep his coalition together. And for that, he needs very radical far-right fractions that are very much opposing a deal of any sort, or even negotiations, as they said recently. Netanyahu is very unpopular at the moment. His government is very unpopular. Most Israelis do want a ceasefire deal, and they do want, as you say, the hostages back. But it doesn't seem to work. People are literally burning things in the streets. It was a very difficult week in Israel because of the 6 hostages that were recovered from
the bodies
Gaza.
of the hostages.
Yes, and they were recovered, and they were shot, according to the autopsies and the IDF, they were shot by Hamas very shortly before they were found, their bodies were found. In other words, for Israelis who have been living the issue of the hostages, they have come to know these people intimately, personally, over this past year. And to them, realizing these people could have been home safe by now, and this war could have been over, was just too much to bear. And there was a new burst of protests, although there have been protests going on for months now. People have been on the streets all the time, and they no longer know what to do.
I mean, I can hear people listening to this and saying, don't blame the government for those hostages coming back dead. Blame Hamas, who took them in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's clearly, at the heart of this is, how does a government, even a coalition, but a democratically elected government, negotiate with terrorists?
Of course, and it's a very delicate issue, and I think, and we don't know what Hamas would say about the negotiations. We don't know what's exactly happening behind the scenes. What we do know, and what the Israeli people are hearing from their politicians, even those that are in government with Netanyahu, and even those that joined his government at the beginning of this war, even those that are part of the administration, are saying, enough is enough, we need this deal. Even the heads of the IDF, everybody, every kind of security authority in Israel came out and said, enough is enough, we need this deal. So there is a lot of pressure, and I think that what we've seen this past week happening, unlike what happened before this whole month that preceded it, is that you saw how the people's rage in the streets. Everybody is broken, desperate, devastated. The anger, the fury in the streets encouraged even figures in the political sphere that have been very weak over the years in presenting an alternative to Netanyahu or presenting some alternative vision for the region. For the first time, they came out and said to the people of Israel, enough is enough. We need to take this deal. We need a ceasefire.
And yet, Ayala, as you say, that there's been political reaction to what's happened. And yes, not only is Netanyahu not responding to that, he's going further. So he appeared on Israeli television yesterday, brandishing a pointer with a kind of cartoonish map of Israel, showing an occupied Gaza that he is proposing to split into 3, which I don't think anyone serious in the international community thinks is either a good idea or a credible idea. And indeed, the map didn't even, when he, which was entitled His Plan for Palestine, didn't even show the West Bank, leading some people to suggest and ask, does this imply that Netanyahu intends to annex the West Bank? So he's actually going further.
Yes, and Netanyahu loves his props, he loves his presentations, the speeches. This one he's given exactly because of the uprising in the Israeli society and the rage around the incident with the hostages. Families of hostages asked him not to no longer wear even the symbol of the hostages. But still, he keeps framing this as, I am Mr. Security, they are being weak, they are being emotional, and that's why we need this. This is why he went on with these props and map. And the reason that he's not intimidated by the fact that most Israelis are not supporting this war. And there was a new poll that came out last night on the public broadcaster that showed how few Israelis support Netanyahu and his conduct of the war.
What's the number?
32%. Against 60 something that do not trust him to run this war. For Netanyahu, these are very low numbers. And what you can see is that the fact that he only needs to keep his coalition together means that he's only thinking about these far-right parties that threaten to leave if he signs a deal. So this is what threatens his political future, potentially also affects his legal future. And this is why he comes out and tells Israelis, you need this war to go on for you to be safe.
This is a dance of death, Ayala. I mean, it feels like Israel is locked into a kind of almost death embrace with this man, in the sense that it can't end until he agrees to it. But if he agrees to it, then he's out of office, and they can't get rid of him.
Yeah, it's a very complicated state of affairs that we've been. We've seen unprecedented actions like the general strike and things. People are trying to, in all kinds of ways, to make their voices heard. But at the moment, as long as nobody in the coalition, in the leadership, or manages to pressure him out, the only people who are really making him sweat are the far-right, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the people who are saying, if you sign this deal, we are out.
Ayala, thank you so much for coming in. So here in Britain, we could be looking at Robert Jenrick, possibly as the next Conservative Party leader. Over in France, they don't hang around. They just chose their new PM in about 5 minutes.
Well, it has been 2 months.
Well, it has been 2 months and 5 minutes.
Yeah.
The rumours started early this morning that Michel Barnier, as in the former Brexit lord,
Remember
negotiator, exactly, was in the running. And then suddenly it all happened. And he is now the new French Prime Minister.
Yeah, they've gone from a guy who's in his early 30s, Gabriel Attal, to Michel Barnier, who is 73. And Macron has appointed him as Prime Minister. And obviously, normally French politicians who become Prime Minister, not normally, I mean, I was about to say aren't household names. Barnier isn't a household name either in Britain, but probably to a lot of you and to obviously sort of ardent Brexit watchers.
He's an Élysée Palace name.
He's an Élysée Palace name, yeah, exactly.
But I mean, it's extraordinary to think that when Macron first called the election, we were almost expecting Jordan Bardella, you know, this right-wing firebrand that works in the party, Marine Le Pen, to become the next Prime Minister. You cannot imagine anyone less like Bardella than Michel Barnier. And I have to say that Michel Barnier is somebody who I tried really, really hard to get an exclusive with when his book, you know, following the Brexit negotiations, came out. And I was delighted to get it. And then I spent arguably the most tedious hour and a half of my life trying to get a single newsline out of him. So I think he will be tremendous at saying absolutely nothing in the Macron government if Macron doesn't want anything to be said.
But I think that is why he is being put forward. We should say that he will be subject still to a parliamentary vote at some point, or rather his budget will, and so he may not be Prime Minister for very long. And we should say, of course, this all goes back to the snap elections, which were a couple of months ago, and they were
during the Euros,
not long after our, and they were widely expected that the far right would win, or at least have a majority. They didn't. It was very inconclusive, and ever since then there has been all this horse trading and stasis within the French Parliament of just trying to find anyone, because the blocks between the left and the right and so on are so finely divided, or closely divided, that trying to find any prime ministerial candidate who could command a majority has proved very, very difficult for Macron. And in a way, I mean, it's like you say, he's actually weirdly probably better known within British politics than in French politics, really, because his biggest role that he's had
he bored everyone into submission, basically.
Because his biggest
there
role
was nothing memorable that we can ever remember him sort of saying, certainly not in interview styles, but he kind of... He appeared in those meetings with David Davis with huge amounts
EU negotiator.
as the EU negotiator, with huge amounts of sort of bureaucracy, sort of files and papers and homework, to David Davis's nothing, blank desk, and just sort of took all the heat, all the emotion, all the colour, all the excitement, actually, out of any of the negotiations.
But I think he was considered by the EU and EU governments who have done a good job.
Safe pair of hands.
Yeah, a safe pair of hands. And because he's inoffensive, hopefully, I think from Macron's point of view, that he might be able to get through the French Parliament without, at least for a few months, without any more stasis and without any more deadlock. Should just one other thing before we go as well. I mean, obviously
we haven't mentioned today.
Yeah, we haven't. Yeah, exactly. Our very own Mr. Deadlock. He, John Sopel. I know there has been. You see yesterday that was more Oasis tickets announced, a couple of more dates, which is good. But obviously, not everybody's going to be able to get them. And I just thought we could say, given that they may have been a victim of ticket gouging themselves on those events, if they are at a loose end
that day,
or any other day, or you just want to spend a few quid on another must-see event of the next 12 months, there is, of course, John's book tour. John's book tour
in Harrogate.
Yeah. Although we have had, I'm afraid to say,
it's not Wembley, but it is Harrogate.
No, we have had a complaint, or at least I had a complaint on Twitter about one of these events, saying, have to say, incredulous at the price for the John Sopel session in London this month. Far from man of the people pricing, John Sopel is the oasis of the book world. Fortunately not on Ticketmaster, though, as dynamic pricing may have hiked it up even further. Can only be explained by Lewis Goodall hosting. Well, there you go.
Yeah, I think that's slightly unfair because, I was looking at some of the prices that John's charging on his book tour.
Cheap at twice the price, as far as I'm concerned.
You couldn't even get a ticket. I mean, you couldn't even get a first-class ticket to New York for what he's charging.
No.
You couldn't get a seat on Concorde.
And,
you couldn't even get a night at the Ritz.
And that's why the pricing is as it is, because you wouldn't want him going standard economy, would you? You wouldn't want to see John Sopel.
Oh my God, turning right. Ah!
Oh God,
Yeah,
John
awful,
wouldn't do that.
awful.
No, of course not. Well, there we go. Right, that's it for today. See you
We're
tomorrow.
just checking you're listening, so come back soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.